Welcome back, Arcadians. Alex here with another video, and I'm absolutely delighted to present today one of the first talks I've organised for the Arcade Archive, and it is from my favourite podcasters, the Ted Dabney Experience. Now, I don't have enough space down here, so Neil has kindly let us have the cave because he's got a better setup there for all of us to sit down, chill and relax and listen to these guys because they are a fascinating podcast. They've been around a few years now, and what they've been kind of highlighting on is some of the lesser known pioneers from the industry, whether they be artists, designers, CRT makers, and more recently authors like Alan Meads, who wrote the book Arcade Britannia. So we've invited them in today to do a chat and just kind of highlight on some of the episodes from the past and link it in with some of the games that we've got here at the Arcade Archive. So I'm really excited about this because I've been listening to them for such a long time, and it'd be good for you guys to listen to them. If you're into this stuff, you're going to love it because they're great guys. Tony Temple, who's the arcade blogger and world champion at Missile Command. You will hear that Missile Command quite a lot in this video. Paul Jury from Retro Gamer, and Richie May, who you might have seen on my channel before. I did a game room tour of Richie's a while back now, a few years ago now. So all good friends of mine, but great guys, really knowledgeable, very passionate. They love this hobby, and they've got a lot to talk about today. So without further ado, let's join the Ted Dabney Experience. Enthusiasts are coming here today and doing a Ted Dabney Experience.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, hello, how are you? What a wonderful place we are in. How gorgeous for you to join us. I want to say a massive thank you to Alex, not only for putting together the fantastic arcade, mythic arcade, downstairs, thank you, but for inviting us here. A huge thank you to Neil for hosting the talk up here. Neil, respect you. But the biggest thank you is for you all for coming, not only for making the effort to turn up, but for stopping playing some classic arcade games to come and listen to us three for about an hour. We really appreciate it. Okay, this is our first live event. The Ted Dabney Experience podcast started in April 2020. Yeah. It was a lockdown thing. We all needed to find something to do, didn't we? And we've now been going almost 3 years. The idea is that we produce an episode a month. We almost produce an episode a month. So we're on to episode 31.
You're on the squeakiest chair in this room.
I know, especially on the one that moves most as well. We're on episode 31, and our next one will be recording a week on Monday with Eugene Jarvis. So we are keeping it going, so to speak. We really try and get a mix of guests that you will have heard of, people like Ed Logg that wrote Asteroids, and hopefully people that you haven't heard of. People like Carol Cantor basically started the whole idea of marketing around video games and trying to find out what players actually wanted. So we try and get that kind of mix. If you have listened to our podcast, you will know it is all about the guests. We don't do beery banter. There is a space for that, very popular in many podcasts. We don't do it. So therefore, at the end of this bit, we are going to attempt to answer questions, and that's the nearest we're ever going to get to banter, all right? Is that the agreement, lads? Okay. If you have listened to every single episode of the Ted Dabney Experience, we feel very loved. Thank you very much. If you've listened to one or two, thank you so much for your support. If you've never listened to any, I want to say a massive thank you for turning up, and I hope after the next hour, you think, you know what, I might go and listen to some of those episodes. What we're going to do, we have each picked 3 of our favourite clips. We're going to introduce them, we're going to play them, they're only about a minute or two long, and then we're going to say perhaps a little bit about why we chose those clips. But before we start that, over to Tony, who's going to say something about the significance of the name.
Yes, the name. So when we occasionally do get questions, people always say, what's Ted Dabney? What does that actually mean? And when we were in Florida, the 3 of us, and we were thinking we should do this podcast thing, but what are we going to call it? And we had all these, and one of the names that was bandied around was the Billy Mitchell Experience. Yeah. So we were like, well, yeah, it's kind of a name, and people know who he is.
A whole different podcast.
It would suggest an entirely different type of podcast. So. Ted Dabney, for the uninitiated, was one of the co-founders of Atari. And the thought process we had was Ted obviously had a huge impact on the world of arcade video gaming. but he perhaps isn't spoken about as much as his cohort, who, of course, was Nolan Bushnell. So Nolan Bushnell is sort of seen as this, the guy who set up Atari, but actually the story was a lot more complicated than that. And so we sort of felt with Ted Dabney being this sort of bit player, this sort of supporting cast guy, that's the type of guy ideally we really want to shine a light on, along with the Ed Logs and the Eugene Jarvises. And hopefully you'll get from some of the clips we've shown with you today, there will be guys who are talking who you've never heard of, but actually they play a really super important part in the history of video gaming. So it's all about shining a light on these other characters. Richie, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about.
I was going to, but I mean, there's only the technical aspects which, Paul, you were sort of keen for me to sort of. Rich, do you want to say something in the intro?
So you're an equal part.
No, well, yeah, I mean,
you're not. But we can pretend that you are an equal part.
So I edit and produce the podcast. It's largely Tony and Paul who get the notes together, and I sort of pretend I know what I'm talking about when I'm reading my bits. But I think what we did want to do is produce something that, I mean, we don't make any money from this. It's a labour of love, but we wanted it to sound professional. I think it's fair to say, and I like to think we've done a reasonably good job of making it sound like we have slightly higher production values than we might actually have. So that's all I want to say about that, really.
It's really about just producing a body of work. I think where we want to get to is, hopefully in years to come, people can look back on it and listen to these stories told by guys who, let's face it, are not getting any younger. And there's going to be a time when all of this knowledge and anecdotes and information just kind of disappears. So it's almost like an archive.
It's like the arcade archive. Let's see what you did there. Before we start playing the clips, this man's very modest. If it wasn't for Richie, this podcast wouldn't exist. Not only did he come up with the idea in the first place, is that he spends all the time recording and editing it, so respect due. Right, let's hear some of his amazing work. So, that's us three there. So, the first clip I've picked is Dennis Koble. Dennis Koble was the fourth programmer employed at Atari in 1976. He was right at that transition from when games were made solely in hardware to when they were started being programmed. I'm always fascinated by that, and I don't know about you lot, but my mind always boggles when I think that the games pre-1976 were made on circuits. There's no. I think if you grew up typing in listings, you kind of get the idea of 10 print Paul is ace. You kind of get that. But it's like, no, all these games were just made in circuit boards. I'm like, what the? Dennis joined just at the time when they were starting to use microprocessors, so they were employing programmers. He is probably best known in his early part of his work because he produced Sprint, which was not only the start of a series of Sprint, which is still going to some extent today, but it spawned the whole genre of the top-down racer. He then went on to co-found Imagic. He produced Atlantis, which sold over 2 million copies, if you got that on your Atari VCS. He also went on to program Sonic Spinball, sold its millions. He also did the PGA series, sold in its millions. The reason I'm saying all that is he is not untypical at all. He's unbelievably modest. All the people, not only through the podcast, but through Retro Gamer that I've interviewed, I'm always staggered that these people have produced such hugely selling things that were so important to us. And yet they have no egos at all. I often wonder if we did a podcast about sort of aging rock stars, I'm not entirely sure we would get people as sort of magnanimous and amazed that we're interested in what they did all those years ago. The clip I'm going to play is Dennis talking about someone else. I think in the podcast we often do that and ask the person we're interviewing, what did you think of? Now we partly do that sometimes because sadly some of the people aren't with us anymore. So we've asked people about their memories of Tim Skelly, who did Star Castle and Warrior, or Jan Yamamoto, I pronounced that right. Kan Yamamoto.
Kan Yamamoto.
We got there in the end. Right, yeah, who did Mad Planet. So sometimes it's because they're no longer with us. Other it's because they're hard to reach. So Dave Toyer, who obviously produced some fantastic games, including a game called Missile Command, which some people seem to like for some reason, we're in touch with him, but he's quite hard. It's a British game. It's quite hard to get hold of. Plus, all Japanese developers. If anyone has got any links to get Japanese developers on the show, that would be fantastic. So this particular one is we asked Dennis about Nolan Bushnell. Hang on, you've just mentioned you went to parties at Nolan's house. We need to ask because it's a big concern of the podcast. Does that mean you ever got in his hot tub?
I personally didn't, but I know quite a number of people who did. I mean, we were there many times. It was kind of funny. I guess I could draw a parallel a little bit to Elon Musk, is probably a very similar individual to Nolan in a lot of ways. I think that entrepreneurs like that, like Nolan and Elon, and there's been a few others along the way, very much, again, very smart people, hard workers, legendarily hard workers, actually, but also idea people.
Yes.
And their reach was always really kind of beyond their grasp in many cases.
I don't want to go into Elon Musk's hot tub. I'll make that clear. Which is true. However, I have got a lasting wish that I wish I'd got into Nolan Bushnell's hot tub. The nearest thing we get to a running joke is the hot tub thing. To me, it's just, I'd love to have sat in it, but it just sort of symbolises that whole idea of excess. It's the nearest thing you get to a kind of rock star image. So I'm afraid I apologise for often asking about that. When you get chance downstairs, I think you've got a sprint cabinet. Is that right? Not only is the game, it's still fun, and you can definitely see where it went, where they took that idea. But just have a look at the side art. It's absolutely beautiful. Bob Flimate, I think that's right. So please do admire that when you go downstairs. Tony, over to you.
So for my first clip, I chose our friend Warren Davis. So Warren was our first episode, and when we thought of this idea, and we thought we really need to ease ourselves in with a guest who we know is going to deliver. And Warren is a classically trained actor and is a great orator, so we knew he was going to give us some cracking insight. Warren, of course, worked for Gottlieb. He's primarily known for the arcade game Qbert, that I'm sure you'll be familiar with. The reason I chose this clip is it's a great example of Paul's speciality, which is asking a bizarre left field question. And his question to Warren was, I should also say Warren did some work around comedy, and very early on he took a training course in improv comedy. And so Paul's opening question was, how does improv comedy help with the development of video games? Which kind of astounded Rich and I at the time. He was like, what sort of question is that? However, it did produce an interesting response from Warren, which we'll play now.
Improv comedy is a good preparation for literally anything in life. And when I was learning improv, there were many people taking classes who were not, whose goal was not to be an improv comedy performer. There were creative types there, writers. A lot of writers would take improv. Some actors who just wanted to use it as a tool to free themselves up in some way. But I think improv offers a lot to anyone, just for life, because it sort of teaches you a few things like how to be in the moment and just be present in the current moment, and it also teaches you how to listen and really take in what other people are giving you. Because improvisation on stage is all about taking cues from the other people. It's not about imposing your will. It's supposed to be about you hearing what the other people are saying. And, there's this phrase, yes, and that's what improv is about. You say yes, and. So you take in what you hear and you add to it.
And that was the key point. You take in what you hear and you add to it. And if you read Warren's book, when he talks about Qbert and the development of the game, or better still, if you listen to the Ted Dabney Experience, he goes into it there. This is the point. So Qbert did not have a plan. There was no kind of written down structure of, here's an idea for a game, I'm going to get it down on paper and then I'm going to make it happen. It was very much a voyage of discovery. So some of the things that Warren alludes to there in that clip around you're in the moment, you take advice from other people. And so Warren's brief was literally, come up with a video game, Warren. There's a desk, there's a computer, crack on. With no programming experience, no idea what he was doing. And so there were a number of sort of key moments in the game. He walked past Kan Yabamoto's desk, the guy who wrote Mad Planets, and saw some isometric shapes on his screen. And he looked at those and pictured pictured a sort of triangle shape, of cubes, and so that was the sort of starting point of the game. And then he thought he needed some characters, so he went to Jeff Lee, the artist, and said, "Can you just create some characters for me?" And then he dropped them in, and so slowly this game developed out of nothing, and it was very much improv. And ultimately, there's the cabinet that was produced. You can find that downstairs at Archive, and just have a think about the entire package. I think Cubert's a great example of a game that's more than just what's happening on screen. Are you drawn in by the marquee, the side art, the bright colours? It's an absolute classic. So.
And Alex has got the swear marquee on his, right? Which wasn't an original release. It was like a fan thing, wasn't it? In association with Jeff, the artist. So for my clip, I've chosen Evelyn Seto. Sorry. So given the era, it's probably unsurprising that there was a paucity of women in the industry. But like Carol Cantor, who Paul alluded to earlier, another guest of ours and the industry's very first market researcher. Many women did work, but just didn't work in engineering and game design. They were kind of in other areas within the different companies. And Evelyn worked for Evelyn or Evelyn? I always get this wrong. It's Evelyn. So Evelyn worked for Atari art director George Opperman on all manner of graphic material, cell sheets, aka flyers, as we would know them as, game cabinet art, home game packaging, etc., including the famous Atari Fuji logo. And first and foremost, I think for me it was interesting to hear her talk about her background, her family's restaurant business, and perhaps the parental expectations that came with that. Perhaps the typical expectations of a Chinese immigrant family during the 70s in Los Angeles, which she dove into. And she did spend a good chunk of her youth there. But her parents were understanding enough to allow her to pursue her artistic ambitions. And she eventually, through a series of different Silicon Valley employers, ended up at Atari. It's notable to say that this episode was co-hosted by Tim Lapatino, author of The Art of Atari, a wonderful book, who I'm sure a lot of you probably have, and also Pac-Man, The Birth of an Icon, and he was the consummate pro. He was a great co-host. Paul stepped aside for that
Tony,
particular
actually.
episode. Was it Tony?
Thanks for making such an impression on you that episode, mate.
I thought it was you, mate. Sorry. Hold on, I'm just going to do my notes. So Tim was our introduction to Evelyn. Because she was initially reticent to be interviewed, I think, and the way into that was to have Tim co-host the show. She didn't really know us from Adam, but she spent many hours walking Tim, through her time at Atari for his book and providing a wealth of knowledge and material for that book. So in this clip, I asked Evelyn, and to be quite reductive about it, what it was like to be a cog in the Atari machine.
To begin with, Tim and I are going to dig into your time at Atari, and Tim will then take you back in time even further. And I wanted to dive straight in by addressing the issue of anonymity at Atari. Obviously not something unique to Atari, to the company. The fact that engineers went wholly uncredited, not to mention that, the industrial designers, graphic artists and illustrators. Did this ever bother you back then, Evelyn? Working with such a creative powerhouse as George Opperman, and being part of such a talented team, or was it simply the nature of being an in-house design team member?
I think it was probably the nature of being in-house. The idea of getting credit for your work when you work for a corporation, I don't think was usual then, because I've worked at other corporations before, and and I worked on other art projects, but we didn't, you didn't get individual credit, and maybe that was just what it was back in the time, because when Atari started, I had just left HP, and people were wearing shirts and ties back then, and you worked for, we weren't IBM, but along IBM was in our valley as well, and that's, it was aerospace. Everybody still wore shirt and ties, and they wore their pocket protectors with their pens in it.
Okay. So
I think it was all collaborative, and I don't think individual credit was usual back then.
Sure.
Yeah, so, by asking that, I was kind of wondering, I was not hoping, but wondering if Evelyn, looking back, might have had any misgivings about, essentially being anonymous. But as you can hear, she was quite sanguine, matter of fact. Very used to being a team member already before she got to Atari, clearly understood her role, etc. No huge ego. either then or now, and was most grateful really primarily, as we found out, for her time spent working with the talented and extremely underrated George Opperman, who sadly passed away in 1985. I think there's an understandable temptation when, talking with women who worked in the industry back then, to ask if there was any discrimination they may have experienced in, like 1970s America. But the answer so far, at least for us, is no, they didn't. So, but we always like to ask.
We do.
Yeah.
Thanks, Richie. Okay, for my next clip, I picked Ed Rotberg. Ed Rotberg. Wait, that's Ed now. Sorry, Ed. Yeah, you're right on cue. Is that Ed Rotberg joined Atari in January 1979. His first game was a baseball game, which you may not have heard of, because it was not a home run. See what I did there? All right. Which was kind of interesting because there was a thing at Atari called Toyer's Law, named after Dave Toyer, which the idea is that your first game would not be a success. However, he followed Toyer's Law. His second game was Battlezone, which again, an all-time classic of that era. The reason I picked this clip is because when we play some of those games back then, from the 70s and 80s, that golden era, is that for us, when we play them, they're finished, aren't they? We get the whole game, and that's what we've been given. What you forget is all the design decisions that went along the way, the things that could have been, the things that were implemented but then jettisoned. I once interviewed a guy called Greg Tavares, who did Loco Rocco, fantastic game on the PSP, if you ever played it. And I was saying how much I love that game. He said, you got to remember, he says, you get 100% of what we give you, but that's only 70% of what we wanted to. And I just thought that was really nice. So I've picked this little clip because it's about one aspect of Battlezone that I think Battlezone would not be the same game without this, that almost didn't make it in. Thanks, Tony. Also, we wanted to ask about the radar system at the top of the screen, which is an ingenious way. In fact, I don't think the game would really work without you being able to see where the enemies are, because it's this pseudo 3D environment. I just wondered, was that something that you implemented from the start, or something that you realised, whoa, we need to put this in, or else players are going to say, where the hell are the enemies?
I kind of think we implemented it fairly early on. There's no real way, there was no rear view mirror, which was another thought. And Steve Calfee in particular hated my game because he couldn't see the enemies behind you, the radar, and, he wanted a game. We eventually said we should do a game for Steve Calfee called Nothing Strikes Back. So that he could just go out and kill things and not have to worry about anything blowing him up.
Yeah, that was it. Oh, Steve.
Steve. Pretty much right.
We have interviewed Steve Calfee, which was a bit of a coup. And he's a lovely man as well. But there was other ideas. So Ed in that episode talks about this idea of making Battlezone like a stereo. I want to say phonics, it's the wrong word. Stereoscopic view. Yeah. So it's probably that word.
Yeah,
it's easy for you to say. Right. So basically, in the viewfinder, like there, they would put two little discs that would spin like this, and it gave, because they didn't somehow fix it. You probably know this better than me, but would fix it so that the image would only be seen through it, so it would look kind of 3D. And I'll quote here. He said, "We got it working in the lab, but some people got motion sickness. So that never went into production. But it did give a really cool effect, right?" And you just think all these things that could have been. I must say, disc spinning at high speed that near your eyes, I think maybe that was another reason why they didn't go for that. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you. So my next clip is our friend Steve Golson. Steve worked for a company called General Computer Corporation. And the reason I picked this clip is Steve's story, and indeed General Computer Corporation's story, is slightly different to traditional manufacturers. So Atari designed, created, built, launched arcade games along with the Williams of this world and the Centuries. General Computer Corporation took a slightly different approach, and that will hopefully become apparent from the clip.
Steve, I find it interesting that your first foray into development was not so much about let's write cool video games, but it was really more from a perspective of an operator. There's a problem here with our business model, and we should try and do something about it.
That's a very good way to put it. It was from the operator's point of view. And there were things you could do to the games that you had bought, particularly as, even on pinball, particularly as pinball games got microprocessor controlled. And you could adjust things. Well, do you get 3 balls or do you get 5 balls? And you could adjust the bonus structure of the game. And so you could do a lot of things to control how difficult the game was for the player. I mean, pinball, arcade owners would do things as simple as adjust the feet on the game so that there was more of a tilt to the play field, which made the ball roll faster and made it harder to play. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of the arcade owner doing stuff to the game to make it more difficult so that the arcade owner makes more money, that was already an accepted thing.
So Steve's talking there really about the arcade business model. Something you might want to think about, Alex. So I own this arcade. It's 1981. I've got all the latest releases, and these kids are coming in. They're getting better and better and better at games, and what that means is my coin drop reduces. So Tony sits on Missile Command for 6 hours having a fantastic time, but he's only
play Missile Command.
We can talk about that at the end. So I could sit and play Missile Command for 6 hours, which was great for me and great for the people walking past going, no, he's good at Missile Command. But the arcade operator's going, oh, gee, I can't take any money because no one else can get on the game. So
which game was that?
Missile Command. Missile Command. Yeah, there's a picture of one there. And so General Computer Corporation recognised this, and so their first release was a add-on kit for Missile Command called Super Missile Attack, which was unlicensed, unauthorised, and they were sort of skirting on the edges of the law, and it ended up in a court case, which of course you can listen about in a great more detail. But General Computer Corporation were also responsible for Miss Pac-Man, which ended up being the highest grossing arcade game ever released in the US, not only in terms of numbers, but in terms of revenue. And so I just thought it was interesting that Steve was able to give us a perspective from a slightly different angle, that we didn't just produce games, we actually produced kits to help operators, which was a slightly different thing. Which then, of course, sort of leads us on to other subjects like, well, what about if you had just one modular arcade cabinet and you were able to pull out a PCB and replace it with a different one? And then, of course, you get onto the whole subject of jammer cabs. And so, this was the sort of pre-singular cabinet with multiple games in. This was people essentially hacking what was an existing arcade game to help operators to extend the life of their games at a fraction of the cost of going back to Atari and buying a whole brand new game for $2,500–3,000.
Oh, it's me, isn't it? Yeah. Dr. Alan Meads. So he was our interviewee for the latest episode. It's quite a long clip, actually, this, because he speaks fluently and quickly. So I'll try and keep my intro to a bare minimum. So this was our most recent episode, and I think a real treasure. And it was wonderful to get an insight into the unique history and culture of the British amusement arcade. A history that really can be traced back hundreds of years, and I particularly enjoyed Alan's theories on the social aspects of British arcades. The fact that some arcades perhaps even functioned as de facto youth clubs of the British working class, with owners keeping a watchful eye in partnership with local police on kids that may be in a spot of bother. And yes, the arguably mythic neon-lit American arcade of the late 70s and early 80s, as depicted in movies such as Tron, may really be just that, as admittedly wonderful, an admittedly wonderful figment of our collective imagination. And I think primarily this episode, for me, really put what we have done so far into context, didn't it, really? Alluding to that mythic arcade. So play the clip, Errol.
Streets
of Eastbourne,
who were based here in the UK. Now, Streets of Eastbourne, I've owned a few of their cabs over the years. They were a relatively small player, as you say, based in Eastbourne, but somehow along the way, they managed to secure a legit relationship with Williams, where they licensed and distributed spangly versions of Defender, Stargate, and Robotron in some very distinctive looking cabinets. What's their story?
Well, Streets of Eastbourne, the Streets family have been involved in arcades since the early days. So it was the Streets brothers, if I remember correctly, who were involved in, well, from about the early 1900s. So they've got a long lineage in the arcade trade. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, I don't think they came from a showman tradition. I think they came from kind of a manufacturing tradition and then went into operating. But so think about Streets as being almost part of the woodwork. They are a long-established manufacturing company that made electromechanical arcade machines and operated arcades. So they didn't get huge, but they were considered a reliable, trustworthy manufacturer of machines, kind of much like Crompton's, but actually they existed before Crompton's, and they were kind of eclipsed by Crompton's. Now, I think that the Williams link is a bit of a red herring in the sense that, okay, I one of the chaps that I interviewed was Colin Mallory. So again, he lives a couple of miles away from me. He was the chap that negotiated the in fact he was the guy that negotiated Defender into the UK. So he negotiated the deal for Defender. He also negotiated the deal for the sit-down Star Wars machine that he went to the big spangly do, and he so the trade fair, the unveiling of Star Wars, he didn't like it, but his daughter did, and so he decided to import it into the UK, and it was one of the best things he ever did. Anyway, he told me that he was working for Associated Leisure at this time, and Associated Leisure were the distributor for Williams, and because he negotiated the Defender deal, he knew that they could get as many boards as they wanted, but one of the issues that was proving a problem for them was getting the marquees and getting all of the hardware made. So because Associated Leisure had recently negotiated the purchase of Streets, the logical step was that they would then run they created essentially a machine called Streets Defender that had the Streets branding, and it was a Defender machine. You had official Williams board inside it, and essentially that was what they did. And then that continued a little while longer. Now, Streets closed not that long after that, so it was really Streets had been bought by Associated Leisure, and that was how that happened. So it wasn't that this little old Eastbourne company forged a link with Williams. It was that this massive company, Associated Leisure, had bought them out and then had used their connections to expand their line.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, what I really like about this clip is, I mean, first of all, you can hear that Alan really knows his stuff. We just let him roll. I mean, I like that we went in with sort of arcade game nerd received wisdom, and Alan really fleshed things out for us and sort of recalibrated our assumptions, if you like. Just a great example of why we love doing what we do, I would say.
Okay, my final clip is a chap called John Newcomer. He joined Williams in 1981, and I find John fascinating because he wasn't a programmer, he wasn't an engineer, he was a game designer, and he's definitely the first one Williams ever employed, and I'm pretty sure, tell me if I'm wrong, that he's the first person ever employed just as a game designer. He couldn't code or anything like that. He came from a toy manufacturing background. So he's back through the 70s, he's helping design various, not often electronic, they're usually board games and things like that. The point is that he came with a fresh pair of eyes. And so he wasn't just focused on what can the tech do, he was like, what's fun? What would be good to do? And I think at a time now when you look at the video game industry, it's full of people from a broader range of talents. So you've got musicians, you've got artists, you've even got writers, okay. But when John joined, it was really pioneering. I also like the fact that he was big about games should be fun. And I love this little aside he gives, that when he arrived at Williams, he delivered his CV stuffed inside a rubber chicken. So when I said, any reason for that? He said, I wanted to stand out. You would. He said also, I want to know whether they'd take a joke, because, you know, these are businesses. These are people in suits that are employing you. Would they take a joke? And also said it was a little nod because he was already thinking about a game based on birds. So the clip we're going to have is me, Tony actually asking him about his inspiration for Joust. The reason I like this is partly because Tony has a lovely little quote from P.T. Barnum, which made me smile, and clearly you'll hear it makes John smile as well.
There's an interesting quote by P.T. Barnum, who said no one ever made a difference by being like someone else. And I guess this is where Joust comes in, right? So, you know, Joust is arguably unlike anything seen before. So it's interesting that that ended up being the game to be developed. I mean, specifically the sort of core mechanic of players riding on giant birds. Where did that idea come from?
I love the Barnum quote and have lived by that in some cases, and Joust was definitely one of those cases, where if you're going to do a flying game, let's do something different and also take into effect the technology. So if you have aircraft going across the screen, there's something that doesn't quite feel right, because they're not moving fast enough. But if they move too fast, you can't really play it. But a bird naturally goes into your mind as something that goes slower. Mm-hmm. And so it feels right. And this was something I researched a lot as well, because I'm a avid movie buff. Then I was reading all kinds of comic books and Frazetta, fantasy, all that stuff. And so there was all kinds of references in my head for different characters and mythology and stuff of flying. And I also went to the library and I was looking up what are the most common dreams of people, and flying was ranked as like number 2, where people wish they could fly, or other similar questions like, if you had a superpower, what would you want it to be? And flying ranked up there. So I thought the psychology was right.
Thanks. Yeah, because he was a game designer rather than a programmer, it means that he produced these incredibly detailed game design documents. And I can't believe this. I interviewed him about the making of Sinistar years ago, and he sent me the original design document. Treasure. And what's fascinating, it's handwritten. Well, as you can see, it's handwritten. It was called Juggernaut back then. But when you look through, you can see all the ideas that made it and the ideas that didn't. Like, if you like Sinistar, I do like Sinistar. But have you ever thought that it needs to be a bit more? I really like Sinistar, but after a few... and his idea, he said, I was going to have, there's a little pilot inside the Sinistar, and then when you destroy it, he tries to escape, and then you chase him, and then you have multiple. So you can see all these things that didn't happen because of, going back to the Battlezone one, they ran out of time, they ran out of money, you need to get that game out. Remember, these are commercial products. Just one last thing. So if flying is the second most common thing that people dream about, it's got to be sex, number 1, isn't it? And I'm thinking he missed a bit of a trick here. He could have combined these two, bum jousting. Tony.
And now we cancelled. All right, okay. So it's me now. Is it Tony?
It's me now.
It's Tony, isn't it? Sorry.
I'm just wondering how I can follow.
How do you follow bum jousting? Jesus.
You owe me for that.
I'll talk to you. I will talk to you later about that, Paul.
Oh yes, Doug Wismer. So Doug is a great example of the supporting cast of the industry. Doug works for Electra Home, and Electra Home were the manufacturers of, I want to say, the majority, or certainly a significant chunk of the CRT monitors that you guys will play when you fire up a classic arcade machine. The context of this clip is he talks to us about how he made contact with the arcade industry. Electra Home were in trouble. It was the late 70s. JVC and a whole host of other Japanese manufacturers had turned up in Canada, which is where Electra Home were based, and they were starting to undercut their existing market, which of course was consumer CRT television sets. The company was in a whole heap of trouble. They weren't selling TVs anymore, and it was desperation stakes. And essentially, management sat Doug down and said, Doug, what can you do? We need to get ourselves out of this hole. And so that's the context of what you're about to hear.
So what was the starting point in terms of looking for opportunities in this new arcade industry?
Well, part of my study of this was to look through some magazines, and I don't remember the titles of which ones they were, but I did see a company called Atari, which didn't mean anything to me at that point, but I saw there was a name, Atari, and there was another name, Steve Bristow, and there was a small article about something that Steve had talked about in there, and that he was, I think, engineering manager. So I gave him a call and just told him what I was doing and that what we could do. And he was extremely interested in what we could do because he knew that at some point they were going to need color monitors. He didn't really explain it to me at the time, but I think in the back of his mind he realized they needed another supplier, but said he was unable to talk to me because he was heading to Chicago to a trade show, the AMOA show, the next day. I ended up meeting him in Chicago on the following day. As a matter of fact, I thought best opportunity is he's close, I'll go and see him. And from there, I was definitely encouraged to work with them, which we did.
What I liked about that quote is he went on to say, when he mentioned there, he had a phone call with Steve Bristow. Steve said, "Look, I've got to go because I'm flying to a trade show tomorrow." He literally went back into the office and said, "Make me a brochure." He literally walked into the marketing department and said, "I need a brochure," and they literally knocked something up, got it printed, stuck it in a briefcase, jumped on a plane, sat in front of Steve. So just the sort of humble beginnings of what became a very significant income stream for Electrohome, and just that kind of sense of entrepreneurialism that, Doug was looking for another way of essentially saving Electrohome. And it clearly turned into something huge. And he also drops us right into the specific point in history when Atari and indeed other manufacturers around sort of 78, 79, 80 were about to make the change from what had up to that point been black and white games over to colour. And Electrohome just turned up at exactly the right point where Atari said, "Yeah, we need to go colour." And Electrohome went, "We can help you with that." And thus started a long and successful partnership. And indeed, Electrohome went on to sell arcade monitors to other manufacturers, including Williams, Gremlin, Sega. Great episodes. We had some debate about whether we get this guy on. Is this
the good thing about this episode is I send links every now and then to friends who have literally no interest in either video games or arcade games or pop culture history whatsoever.
Why are you friends with them?
Well, I ask myself the question every now and then. And this is one of the episodes where a friend of mine was like, I've got no interest in this. You've managed to make something ostensibly really niche and quite boring into quite a fascinating interview. That was high praise.
When a monitor goes pop, it's like, oh no, we've got to pull it out, try and figure out what's wrong with it. But so when you're down there playing, think about how rare those CRT monitors actually are.
Yeah.
So over to Rich for our very final clip.
Yeah, I mean, where would we be without talking about Walter Day? So Walter Day, as it says on the screen, arguably the grandfather of esports. But what can you say about Walter Day that he hasn't already said about himself a million times before? Every available opportunity. But we were curious to get Walter on the record about his friend and confidant, Billy Mitchell, whom, full disclosure, Tony actually knows fairly well and can attest to being, to the best of all available knowledge, a nice bloke. But that said, there is the issue that won't go away, which is of alleged, some would say proven, fabricated, whatever, high scores. And although it wouldn't be right for us to add to that mountain of opinion, I don't think, I personally don't quite buy Walter's assertion that the tech is far too complicated for Billy to understand.
Let's talk about Billy.
But thanks for starting the...
Sorry.
No, it's all right.
Close friendship, Billy, and your partnership with him over the years has been, the subject of much debate. What's your take, for the record, on recent events, recent allegations of cheating? Let's be frank, that those are the allegations. I personally don't follow this story too closely, but I know a lot of people do. I know a lot of our listeners do. So, Walter, take the mic.
Well, first of all, I've watched Billy Mitchell grow up, And I can't believe what a good person he's grown into. He's so kind and considerate to other people and so helpful. So I take my hat off to Billy. As far as the allegations, the idea that he had MAME and stuff like that, I just can't see it. See, I'm prepared to testify that he didn't use MAME because I never saw him involved with MAME. I never saw him talk about MAME. He didn't like MAME. He was against MAME. And also he's kind of like not competent with technical stuff. And he simply could not have engineered this incredibly elaborate cheating method of having save states or something like that.
As though it's the world's greatest conspiracy. So I don't really quite buy Walter's assertion that the tech is far too complicated for Billy to understand. It's an amusing appeal to authority, though. So we just wanted to get Walter's clip in there. And that also concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you, guys.